the senior Belfer comes over to the U.S. by boat from Poland, and on the boat over, the Nazis invade Warsaw, and he immediately has to get to work in New York to bring his family. They're Jewish. He starts importing feathers and sets up the Belfer Corporation. By the 1950s, he wins the contract with the Army to make sleeping bags for the Army during the Korean War. They set up Belfer Petroleum Company, and they just keep growing. And what was a refugee story becomes a wild American success story. His son comes into the business with him. And so by the time we get to 1980s, he has very quietly become a billionaire. They're a very generous family. The Belfer Petroleum Company gets bought for an ungodly amount of money. They're purchased by Houston Oil and Gas. Houston Oil and Gas eventually changed their name to Enron. And when they run into their trouble in the 2000s, the son, who's on the board of directors, he rides it down to zero, $2 billion gone. Jewish family in New York is eventually introduced to Bernie Madoff. So they roll out of Enron into Bernie Madoff. By the way, this has a happy ending. I promise you the Belfers
and
are fine.
It's not over yet.
Right. So they're with Bernie Madoff. Bernie blows up. Maybe we didn't have any success doing it ourselves. We trusted an outside party. That didn't work. Maybe this stock thing isn't for us. Let's roll into this new technology called crypto, and they roll into FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. And I said they're okay. 96% of the monies invested with Madoff were returned, so it's not a giant hit there. Because FTX was more disorganized than corrupt, they just had a bunch of kids didn't know what the hell they were doing. They had crypto accounts everywhere. By the time the special master unwound that, you ended up getting 118 cents on the dollar. So some of their investments worked out. The Bitcoin recovered post-FTX. So everybody was made whole. But the takeaway from the Belfers are, do you really have the skill set to do this yourself? Are you sure? Because to lose $2 billion because, hey, it's a bad look for a board member to be selling, that's single stock risk and it's bad judgment. To roll into somebody where there were obvious warning signs, and this isn't hindsight bias, people in real time talked about Madoff as doesn't make sense, it has to be a fraud. Lastly, do you really need to be the first guy into crypto? I mean, or even, an early adopter. You're a billionaire. You've already won. Your goal isn't to how do I take $1 billion and turn it into $10 billion. It's how do I take $1 billion and not let it become zero.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Barry Ritholtz, founder of Ritholtz Wealth Management, overseeing $5 billion in assets, and author of the new book, How Not to Invest, The Ideas, Numbers, and Behaviors That Destroy Wealth. He has spent decades helping investors avoid costly mistakes through his Masters in Business podcast, influential blog, The Big Picture, and his Contrarian Insights. Barry, how are you? So nice to see you.
Doing well. Glad to be here.
So excited. Grateful that Tom Morgan, our mutual friend, introduced us. He's working on his leading edge community platform and pursuing curiosity, and he was kind enough to put us in touch. I loved your book. I have so many questions. I want to jump right in. If you let me, I always ask my guests about the early days, childhood, upbringing. How do you think that time shaped you, your relationship with money, and the career path that you chose?
I get that question from time to time, and I don't know how my early days shaped me. I know, like when we were younger, we were kind of hardscrabble. Went to a state college. I paid for it myself. To me, it's always been a little bit challenging answering that question because most people respond to, hey, I want to be able to have the freedom to do this, that, and the other thing, and I don't have enough money to do that. So maybe I better throttle back my spending habits. And my attitude was kind of the opposite. Hey, double entry bookkeeping. If I don't want to spend the emotional bandwidth keeping a budget, balancing a checkbook, in the back of my head, all I want to know is what is my checking total. So I always just had a running total. Made me really good at math. Like, can I afford this? Am I going to be able to spend this? Am I going to bounce a check? Back in the day. So my attitude was, gee, if you want to do this, that, and the other, you want to have the freedom, and I don't mean to just buy junk. I mean to not worry about what your costs are going to be, then you better make some more money. And I think not a lot of people necessarily look at budgeting that way. And I think some of that comes out in the spending part of the book.
I mean, you say outright in the book you don't like to budget. The solution was to make more money, which was, something that you don't talk about when you think of budgeting. You think of spending less. You were thinking, let's just make more.
Framing in context is a big part of the book. We all have our own personal foibles and cognitive issues. And, I won't even go as far as to say neuro divergences. But for me, I know that I am both impatient and disorganized. And when I have a finite amount of time, energy, emotional patience to spend on something, I didn't want it to be budgeting. I didn't want to have to spend effort paying attention to money, which sounds really counterintuitive. I wanted the freedom to just go through life, and I don't mean randomly buy a Rolls Royce. I mean go out to dinner and not have to say, wait, can I afford sushi or are we going to ramen? I didn't want that sort of cluttering up my limited focus. And so my approach was just, hey, you better go into a professional career so at least you don't have to worry about, the basics. Having paid for college and grad school myself, having worked through college as a waiter, as a bartender, as a short order chef, like I did a lot of things. I worked building decks and doing landscaping, and it was just, gee, this physical labor is hard. You better find a way to make a decent income working indoors at a desk, not standing on your feet all day.
I like the sound of that. I'll come back to the Rolls Royce, but before that, towards the end of the book, you write, one thing I have learned from 30 years of working in finance, people sure can be weird about money. Let's start there. How are we weird about money?
We're very weird about money. We don't think through all sorts of things involving money. We don't understand compounding and how that works. We only see one side of the coin. Everything in life is a series of trade-offs and a series of risks and rewards and benefits and detriments. The entire Instagram culture of flex, we went on vacation right before the pandemic to this place that had reopened after it was rebuilt in Puerto Rico after a hurricane destroyed it. And this woman is at the Shays 3 down from us sitting on the beach, and she's got the phone and she's taking selfies, and not for 5 minutes, but for all day. And by the third day, I finally had to say, I'm sorry, I got to ask, what the hell are you doing? It's beautiful here. You're not reading. You're not going out on the boat. So, I'm an Instagram influencer. This is my job. I'm like, so wait, Your job is to, and I'm thinking, how does the person who's watching that feel? Oh my God, I wish I was in the Caribbean. I wish I was on this vacation. I wish. And the same is very true for all the things we see. We see the asset, but we don't see the corresponding liability. So I know some people who have really nice houses, the next neighborhood over from them, and I know them personally, and it's like, you can't afford that house. How indebted are you? Like, that's a $3 million, $4 million house. What the hell? And then I know other people with collections of cars and other, expensive toys. And their deal is, I only pay cash. I don't finance anything. Everything I own is outright. So sometimes when you're seeing something, you're only seeing the upside of it. You're only seeing the value. You're not seeing the cost, and people are just really weird. I have a million stories from clients and prospective clients who, this is pretty typical. I bet any advisor in the audience will recognize this. Someone is wildly successful. They spent their whole life working and saving and investing and building a business and rising through the ranks, and now they have more money than they know what they can do with. Yeah. And to get them to like, hey, you're 70, why don't you slow down and enjoy some of your money, and they just can't. It's really hard to make that pivot. We are weird with money.
Somehow it's always extreme. Either we overspend or we save too much. I wrote an article when a lot of people were posting New Year's resolutions. I posted an article, The Art of Spending Money. And I was thinking how when I talk to clients, I manage money for families, how the topic comes up. How do you actually spend it once you have it? It grows over time, it compounds. But it's also an art to learn how to spend it and actually enjoy it. And related to that, I want to ask you about something you write in the book. We hear those stories about billionaires driving 20-year-old Toyotas and other people foregoing daily lattes. But you tell us to buy a new car and get that latte. Tell me more.
Sure. So by the way, Morgan Housel's new book, which I think comes out over the summer, is literally called The Art of Spending Money, Simple Choices for a Richer Life. Let me see the publication date on that. Oh, that's October. So that's coming out in the fall. Buy a latte, get a new car. So look, the math on this is really simple. You're going to make a certain amount of money, spend less than you make, and invest a decent chunk of it. Those three simple rules, it's not that hard. And yet we see on a regular basis all the spending scolds telling people, don't buy a latte, never buy a sports car, don't buy a sailboat, and like one thing after another. And the reality is they leave out the last part, which is if you can't afford it. If you can't afford a sailboat, don't buy a sailboat. The example I use in the book is, so I live on an island. When I was younger, we used to bike down to the harbor, take a fishing boat, and then eventually we owned a little putt-putt boat. And now I have, for the past 20 years, the same little Sea Ray. The boat is the least expensive part of boating. So when you're looking at these giant yachts in the marina, that has no interest for me personally. But if I could take a few friends and family out and spend a day on the water and have a couple of beers and a picnic lunch, that's a ton of fun. If that's what gets you excited and you can afford it, go do it. The article that sort of sent me off on the deep end was Kawhi Leonard, who I just watched the LA Clippers dismantle the Knicks from like a 25-point. The Knicks were up 25 points in the first half, and they ended up losing. But Kawhi Leonard is this guy who plays both great offense and defense. He has a 10-year, $103 million contract, and he's driving a 25-year-old shitbox SUV. And all I can think of is the latest, greatest cars have lane detection, blindside warnings, lane detection alerts, automatic stop and collision avoidance, like one safety feature after another. I don't know, if I have a $103 million contract that could be destroyed by a simple fender bender in Los Angeles traffic, don't you want the greatest safety features possible? To say nothing of your family. Don't you want to protect your family with crumple zones and seatbelt pretensioners? My wife's daily driver is a Panamera, which is a really well-made car. We were T-boned by a woman who I'm pretty sure meant to step on the brake and accidentally stepped on the accelerator. That's the only explanation that I've come up with. And the car was destroyed, and everybody walked away. When you have that sort of, curtains came down and Like, when you see the car afterwards, it's like, holy shit, did anybody survive? And it's like, I chipped a tooth. I had to go to the accident happened right in front of my dentist's office. When I called in about I chipped a tooth in an accident, when in the morning when they're fixing it, she's like, you think this is bad? You should have seen the accident outside of our building. I'm like, that was us. Jeez. Really? The purple? Yeah, that was our car. Oh my God, I didn't think anyone walked away from it. This is what I had. So the idea of not spending money on a new car to save $50,000, $60,000 when you have a $103 million contract, that's not merely ill-advised. That is financially reckless. And we're so happy. You know, Warren Buffett famously flies coach. He also bought a private airline, NetJets or whatever that company he bought, Marquis, maybe it's Emerald or Marquis Airlines. And I promise you, he's flying around private. He's not fighting his way through JFK when he comes into New York.
The big point you're making is that when you're so cheap sometimes, the actual cost that follows might be higher than what you can afford to pay. And it could be your life, in this case, driving a car. And I think it's a very powerful statement.
It's your life, it's your career, but it also reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what money is. And in its most basic form, money is a tool. It's a medium of exchange that allows you to exchange your time, effort, and expertise for all sorts of other things. And you know, we could go wherever you want with that, but I think many people really don't understand what money is.
Can we dive in for a second? Because you have this idea of the money that we use every day, and then the wealth, the capital, however you want to call it, that gets accumulated, can be used over time. And they belong in different places, and you look at them differently.
Sure. So there's a couple of memes out there. The dollar has lost 96% of its value over the past 100 years. The other one was Home Alone, which came out in like 1990. A basket of groceries you bought in 1990 that cost $22 then, cost $75 today. And why would you keep a dollar bill for a century? Why would you buy 25 groceries with $1990? That doesn't make any sense. The dollar's purpose is that medium of exchange, and what it needs to do is hold its value long enough for me to pay my mortgage or rent, buy food, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all our basic security, spend some money on entertainment and travel and hobby, pay my taxes, invest in my business, invest in my own portfolio, and it does that splendidly. Mm-hmm. Why should a dollar have to hold any value for a century? And in the book, I tell the story about two soldiers go off to World War I. They each have a small fortune. They each have $1,000 in 1917. That's a fortune. One of them invests it in the market and in the equivalent of a broad index, and the other one buries it in mason jars. And they each leave instructions to their family if they don't come back. Well, a century later, the guy who put the money in mason jars in the ground, yeah, okay, technically, that's worth $4 compared to what it was worth. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, it's worth $40 compared to what it was worth in 1917. But that's not the dollar's fault. That's great-grandpappy's fault, because he was foolish enough to bury the money in the ground. The other soldier invested it in the market, and over 100 years, that money compounded at about 10.2% a year. And if you understand the rule of 72 and how things double at a given rate, that $1,000 turned into $32 million. I say that number to people, and their heads explode. That's like, That's impossible. Do the math. Here's how it doubles every 8 or 9 years. Over a century, you have 11 or 12 doublings, and so it's 2004, 816, 3264, 128, 250, on and on it goes. And just look at Warren Buffett. That doubling process is what has taken him from merely crazy wealthy to super wealthy, because he's lived long enough to see it double and double again and double again. The vast majority of Buffett's wealth has accumulated over the past 15 years, which blows people's minds. But there was a doubling, and a doubling again. It's insane.
Barry, was there something unusual about the U.S. in terms of market investing? A lot of the stories I hear, I was born in Poland, went to school in Paris, made New York my home, spent most of my adult life in New York. And when I hear those stories, I'm thinking it applied in the U.S. The continuity, 200 years, the stock market has been around for a long time. No war in the country on American soil for a long period of time. Many other places have not had that experience. Is there something exceptional? And the second follow-up question, will it last?
So the geography has been an enormous advantage to the United States over the past few hundred years. You have two giant oceans on either side, so the tendency for there to be these ongoing skirmishes, right? And I don't want to, be blasé about it, but when you have that much ocean between you and your neighbors, you don't end up with a World War I, a World War II. You don't end up with all this internecine fights between different characteristics. Sure, there's plenty of internal fights, plenty of debates among Americans, but we're pretty comfortable that Canada isn't going to overwhelm us from the north or Mexico from the south. And so that has made the United States somewhat different than everywhere else. And we're also blessed with tremendous natural resources. The U.S. pumps out more oil, for example, than Saudi Arabia or Russia. That's, it's so funny watching the politicians say, we should really drill, baby, drill. I think every year for the past 7 years, the U.S. has extracted more oil from the ground than ever before. The technology from fracking. The other thing that makes the United States kind of special is, this sounds very counterintuitive, but I'm starting to come around to thinking that our lack of safety net keeps everybody hyper-focused on their job. And I don't think that's healthy. We have pretty bad health outcomes, and our longevity isn't as good as, like, for example, the Scandinavian countries. They're happier, they live longer. They also don't have a Silicon Valley because at least not to the same degree, it almost feels as if the lack of the ability, this thought is formed from being in London and Brussels in 01, 02, and just shocked at how, when you're back and forth compared to New York, how chill everybody was. In New York, the tension was palpable. And this is still 7 years before the financial crisis. And I just remember thinking, how come everybody is so mellow here? They're not worried about their jobs. If you lose your job, you lose your health care. If you lose your health care and your kid needs a surgery, you're screwed. Half of personal bankruptcies in the United States are caused by medical bills. And so it made me kind of go down a rabbit hole, and it's like, hey, this looks like it's a more comfortable, relaxing, chill lifestyle, but at the same time, that stressor isn't there. And I wonder how many new businesses and startups come from people saying, I can't work for this company or this firm, I got to do it myself. And lo and behold, you have places like the biomedical corridor in Boston, the telecom and networking corridor outside of D.C., all of the Silicon Valley technologies, Seattle and that Washington State region. You have all these, and there are lots of others. I'm just spitballing a bunch. I'm surprised how much software is written in Utah. Like, crazy story. And so you end up with these pockets of these innovation hubs. There's always a major campus nearby. There's always plenty of capital around. And the United States has been really fortunate to have all these things going in its favor. Are we going to score a self-goal? Are we going to take advantage or fail to recognize the advantage the U.S. has had of Pax Americana since the end of World War II? Look, there are plenty of problems here. We have fentanyl problems. We have wealth and income inequality problems. We have an ongoing obesity problem. I mentioned earlier our longevity and health span is worse than a lot of other countries, but who has benefited more from the post-war era than the U.S. economy? And so I assume that eventually cooler heads will prevail and we'll walk back from the precipice. Look, there are legitimate issues with China. They're a bad actor. They don't allow other companies to come into their market. They steal intellectual property. They hack American companies. But it just seems kind of reckless to put a bullet in a six-shooter, spin the revolver and put it to your head. That you can't play Russian roulette with a $28 trillion economy, because you're not happy with China. So I'm hoping, and this is one part wargaming and one part wishful thinking, I'm hoping that we should take the president seriously, not literally, and a lot of these things are negotiating tactics, and we'll walk it back. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but essentially that's how I'm looking at what's been going on. But what's so strange is this reflects a failure of imagination on everybody's part, including my own, because President Trump has been talking about tariffs pretty much his whole adult life. I'm tariff man. It's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He told everybody he was going to do that, and nobody took him literally. And maybe we should have. So I just couldn't imagine anyone would give up the advantages the U.S. has willingly, just kind of stumbling into a global trade war the way we have. It doesn't feel like it was really mapped out. Doesn't feel like it was thought through. Hey, we tried this in 1930. Didn't work out too well.
To make it more timely, I want to bring up something that you write in your book that I really, really liked. You said that politics and investing make for terrible bedfellows. And you have all kinds of examples. You have your Democrat friends that don't invest when the Republican is president and the other way around, and a couple of other stories around it. But it comes up every single time, whoever wins, whoever loses, that somehow we're trying to see and almost predict what that election outcome will mean for our portfolios. You tell us something different.
That's right. Well, first, let's start off by saying, for the most part, 99% of the time, who the president is doesn't really matter to the markets. Markets are a future discounting mechanism. We are looking at what are the cash flows going to be in the future, what are the revenue and profits at some later date. So whoever's in the White House, it's almost irrelevant. They get too much credit when things go right. They get too much blame when things go wrong. I have a chart in the book from Callie Cox who said you end up with this much money when Democrats are in the White House, you end up with this much money when Republicans are in the White House, and you end up with X if you just ignore it and let it compound over time. It turns out that interrupting the flow of compounding is what matters, not who is in the White House. Now, that said, I'm not implying presidents are inconsequential. George Bush had a bunch of tax cuts and had the bad luck of starting his term right after the 20-year bull market crashed. In my first book, Bailout Nation, I argued that he and Bill Clinton, a Republican and a Democrat, both put policies into place that made the financial crisis, if not inevitable, certainly worse than it should have been. So presidents are consequential. You know, the market kind of doubled from the lows till the financial crisis, and if you just didn't want to invest because he was a Republican and had started a war, when does starting a war not lead to certain sectors in the market doing well? You know, when you look at what happens with energy prices and defense stocks and consumer staples, they tend to do well. And I'm always cautious when I talk about things like war and death because I don't want to seem blasé, but I'm just talking about the math behind it. And then President Obama gets elected, and literally the day before the market lows, Michael Boskin writes an article, President Obama's policies are killing the Dow. And from the day that piece was printed, the markets went straight up for the next 8 years. Giant returns. By the way, it's not just Democrats. Trump gets elected in 2016. The market just keeps going straight up, including a 34% 17-day pandemic crash, and the market finishes the year much higher. So under Trump, the markets went higher. Under Biden, the markets went higher. And so I referenced this study, this very clever study these academics did, where they cross-reference, so they get all this anonymized data from one of the largest brokerage firms in the country. And by anonymized, you see people's zip codes, but not their names. Mm-hmm. But you do see all the trades. So they cross-reference this zip code by how that county, how that zip code region voted in the presidential election. And when a Republican, and you can also cross-reference it with their political affiliation, but you don't have to because you have the county. When a county votes for a Democrat and a Republican wins, that county sells equities. When a county votes for a Republican and a Democrat wins, that county also sells equities. So in other words, when the dominant political thought in a given region loses the presidential election, they get out of stocks. And that turns out to be a horrible investment strategy because, wait, you're a Republican and you missed the 8 years of Obama. You're a Democrat and you missed the 4 years of Trump. You're a Republican, you missed the 4 years of Biden. We'll see what happens with the 4 years of Trump, too. But generally speaking, making those sort of decisions based on politics has not worked out.
Your big point is to stay invested through it all. Don't interrupt.
Compounding is a amazing thing. Us humans evolved and adapted in a arithmetic world. We are not exponential thinkers because when do you have to imagine, exponential data when you're trying to survive on the savannah? You don't. There's no reason for that. Our internal models of the world, of which we create at great cognitive expense, it just has to be good enough to keep us alive long enough to procreate. And they're great at that. You can cross a street without getting hit by a bus. You can throw and catch a ball. Like your model of the universe is good enough right up into the point where it comes to thinking about things in a non-arithmetic and a logarithmic way. We're not natural at that because we never had to evolve that skill. The skills and the subroutines we developed. Why are we such pattern recognition machines? Because if you're walking along and something moves in the brush and it's a predator, you're better off jumping out of the way as opposed to becoming something's lunch. And even if you're wrong 99 out of 100 times, if it's the 100th time and the person walking with you doesn't have that pattern recognition, well, those genes don't get passed along. That's a lot of this is a little pop evolutionary psychology, but there's a lot of research that supports much of what we do has come along from our evolutionary history.
And once we interact with a public market with prices moving up and down every day, we get lost and confused. You touched on what I would call experts and forecasts, and I want to dive in specifically on success stories. And you write about the Beatles and blockbuster movies. And the point you're making is how hard it is, even for people that know the industry, to predict the future successes, which in investing is pretty important because we're trying to figure out which one is the next big thing.
Sure. So stop and think about, so there's a couple of parts to this, and one of the themes that kind of runs through the book is that the universe is pretty random. And not only is the universe random, we understand much less about what's going on around us than we imagine we do. And if we really don't know what's happening today, how on earth are we going to have any idea of what a specific asset class is going to be at what price at a specific date? It really, Burton Malkiel wrote A Random Walk Down Wall Street because it's pretty random. Now, because, the 2 million year history of humans, because we've only had speech for, 100,000 years, and we've had writing for a tiny percentage of that. And by the way, of the past 500 years, it was only in a few 100 years ago where most of the population became literate. So because of that, we're storytellers. Narratives are how we tell people, don't eat this mushroom or this berry, it's poisonous. This snake is dangerous. Here's when we can hunt these animals. Here's when you have to head south to warmer country. If there are, back in the day, there wasn't always Google or Perplexity. So we created these stories, and that's how we shared information. So we love a good story. And unfortunately, that sort of storytelling approach really leads us astray on the regular basis.
It's a fascinating phenomenon, and looking back, it all seems obvious, but looking forward, we just can't predict. That's the big point you're making, and the stories you tell in the book, and I'll let the audience explore about the Beatles and blockbuster movies, how people...
But it's not... Here's the crazy thing.
Yeah.
If it was just one or two of these things,
no,
you would say, well, the Beatles were an outlier. Nobody expected anybody to move the direction of music and recording technologies forward the way they do. But we see it in television and film, and we see it in sports and economics. I mean, it's a joke. When was Tom Brady, probably the greatest quarterback of all time, drafted? Like he was like a 7th round draft pick. Nobody really saw his future. So go down the list. It's sports, music, film, television, books, there's an ungodly number of books published each year. Why would we imagine anyone can predict, other than a Michael Lewis book, that anything is going to be, or Stephen King, but now you're telling, that's kind of looking backwards and saying, hey, Peter Lynch and Warren Buffett did really well. We're telling you this after the fact. And and these are things that are, I don't know, relatively easy to predict. When you're greenlighting a movie, you're essentially forecasting what the public's taste is going to be like in 5 years, right? You greenlight a movie, the script has to be developed, actors have to be cast, the script gets rewritten, director is hired, all these things happen, and then it eventually is shot, and then eventually edited. That's 5 years in the future. It's a whole long process. And the experts have no idea what's going to happen. I love the John Wick example because it's modern. When I tell people, the younger guys in my office have no idea what sort of phenomena Star Wars was when it came out in 1977. And there were lines around the block. You didn't have streaming everything. There were a handful of cable had become big back then. So it's obvious that this is going to be a franchise in hindsight. But John Wick is more recent. And so here you have Keanu Reeves, one of the biggest action stars of all time. The guys who were the special effects and stunts coordinator from The Matrix come up with this script about what they called Hong Kong Gun Fu. Not Kung Fu, but gun fu, where you're using guns as part of the punching and shooting process. And so you have this giant winning franchise, The Matrix, this giant bankable star. They couldn't get the film made. In fact, it turned out that Keanu is, and I haven't verified this independently, the exact dollar amount, but he had to finance the end of the film because nobody in Hollywood financed it. The first film is made on like a shoestring. It goes on to do, $60-70 million. The second film has a bigger budget. It does a few $100 million. The third film, does $400 million. I think John Wick 4 or 5 comes out next year. But meanwhile, because Keanu financed it, the back end, he's profiting from how well the movie does. I believe, I haven't independently verified this, I believe he's made more money on the John Wick franchise than everything else in his career combined. And nobody in Hollywood wants to make this. So if those guys have no idea, what makes any of us imagine that we're going to be able to pick a stock that's going to outperform its peers and create a product that, I've been a Mac fan for a long time. I got my hands on one of the first iPods back in the day, and, nobody imagined that the iPod would become the iPhone, and then eventually Apple becomes, at least for a decade, the biggest company in the world. And that's the fan base. It was all but impossible to get people to say, this company isn't going to be left for dead, because we imagine the future is going to look like the past. There's a great quote from Paul Graham: all experts are experts in the way the world used to be, right? You go to school, you get a master's or a PhD, and you're studying what came before because you can't study what's going to come in the future. And so your expertise is immediately past its sell-by date. Sometimes it takes a few years or decades before you come to realize, my understanding of inflation and economics that I developed in the 70s doesn't really apply to a pandemic in the half a century later. But we have, we overemphasize expertise in the wrong way, and we defer too often to experts when we should be saying to ourselves, hey, nobody really knows anything. And I don't mean, there's a great New Yorker cartoon, guy stands up in the aisle of a plane. I'm tired of these pilots telling us what to do. Who's with me? I'm going to take over the plane and fly it ourselves and stick it to big airlines. Oh, wait, what? No. You want the expert flying the plane. You want to listen to surgeons and doctors when they're giving you medical advice. It turns out that vaccines have saved hundreds of millions of lives. You shouldn't be listening to people with no rational training. And again, all these areas are imperfect. But the idea that we should just ignore every bit of expertise that's out there, do your own research. Really? Like, I've looked at your portfolios. Maybe you should stop doing your own research. Maybe there are certain experts you should listen to about things happening now. Just don't take their forecasts as to where stock prices are going to be in the future.
I think it's a powerful revelation, and it made me think of the time when I was working early on in New York at an investment firm, and on my walk I would see lines. You were talking about lines going to the Star Wars movie, but there were lines to the Apple store. And so many of my fellow investors would absolutely ignore the fact that there's something interesting happening there because it's not a value stock. And we completely underestimated the success that was to follow. But
Can I tell you something? It's so funny you said lines on the Apple store. My first hint that something interesting was happening at Apple was I'm wearing Bose headphones now, but you're wearing the white earbuds. When Apple first rolled out their earbuds and it was in white, and I started seeing them pop up on the subway on a regular basis, like, oh my God, half this car has white earphones coming out of their heads. I have to look into that. You know, there's a chapter, the plural of anecdote isn't data, is what we're actually told. That's how people say that expression. The plural of anecdotes aren't data, but the guy who actually coined that expression was a professor and said the plural of anecdote could be data. That's the original expression, which means when you see something anecdotally over and over again, hey, maybe that should start you down a path of investigation because maybe something's going on there. Lines around the block at Apple stores and white earbuds popping up on subways and buses, that should make you say, let's see if where these anecdotes lead and if they take us to some important data.
It's a wake-up call. I want to take it in the opposite direction. There was a time 5 years ago, the streets were empty. Everybody was at home. We had lockdowns. And I want to bring it up because you talk about it in the book, and it's this big idea that the stock market is not the economy, and the economy is not the stock market. But you have this very interesting and powerful idea there that what we were seeing outside, empty stores and empty restaurants, was not a good guidance of how the market will perform. And then you explain how the market composition is different than what you see outside of the window. That idea really made me pause.
So there's a kind of funny story about that. I did a column for Bloomberg on April 1st, 2020, where I wrote, don't assume the pandemic is ending the secular bull market. And you go through non-financial, non-economic externalities, Pearl Harbor, Kennedy assassination, 9/11, there's like dozens and dozens of them. And what history tells us is markets wobble and then they go back to doing what they were doing, what the markets were doing before, the first quarter of 2020 was going up. So please don't assume that this ends it. I got a lot of hate mail for that. And I got an email from someone who said, like 2 months later, the market has already recovered. All right, I bought into your nonsense about externalities. How do you explain the market going up and up and up when all these stores in my neighborhood and your neighborhood are closed? And that was kind of easy to do. It's like, all right, so our local dry cleaner is barely hanging on. The supermarket's in business. The local bookstore is closing. A bunch of restaurants are closing. And all these little shops and small businesses are closing. None of those companies are publicly traded. And not only that, when you look at the universe of publicly traded companies, the ones that were doing the worst, travel, hotels, all the service-oriented businesses, car rentals and movie theaters and, on and on it goes, they're a teeny tiny percentage of the publicly traded market cap. And so I think the math was, and I'm spitballing it, I could look it up in the book if you want the actual numbers, but it worked out that if you took the worst 50 sectors, not stocks, 50 sectors, like travel and all that sort of stuff, and just zeroed them out, made them worth nothing, it took 6% off of the S&P 500. Why? Because both the NASDAQ 100 and S&P 500 are market cap weighted. So for every 100 medium-sized companies, there's an NVIDIA, there's an Amazon, there's a Microsoft, there's an Apple, there's a Google, there's a Facebook. And at the time, there were a whole bunch of companies that were helping people operate remote. We're doing this on Riverside. There was Zoom, there was Google Media, all these companies, Slack, and on, the companies that were, plus, by the way, I don't want to forget, Walmart, Target immediately set up a delivery service. Hey, you don't have to come in the stores. Whatever you want, We'll drop it off at your door, touchless delivery. Oh my God, how innovative and clever. We take it for granted today, but at the time, it's like, I'm stuck in the house. How am I even going to get groceries? Mm-hmm. Back in the day when we were washing off our groceries, because we thought that's how little we knew. We thought COVID was spread through people touching our cans of soup. So when you think about this and say, what is the structure of the market? Well, the structure of the market is driven by capitalization, and the biggest, most global international companies are the one with the biggest market caps. Sure, the Exxon Mobils and BP Amicos are going to suffer because we're flying less, we're driving less, although I actually took a different car out every day in my neighborhood when the first month or two of the pandemic. Nobody was on the streets, no pedestrians, joggers, bicyclists, and I live in this very hilly, curvy area, and my neighborhood was like a racetrack. So we would either take the dogs in the car and just go for a nice drive, or sometimes if I was up early, I had purchased a car on Bring a Trailer, and I was able to inspect and insure it, but I couldn't register it because the Department of Motor Vehicles were closed. And so I had my whole stack of papers ready to explain to the cops why I have neither license plates nor registration. They weren't out. Nobody was out. And that's because we were all hunkered down and not really thinking about what is the structure of the market. And the answer is market capitalization.
I think it's a very, very powerful lesson. The same way, don't look into politics to get guidance on your investments. The same way, when you're walking around, yes, you're going to see lines to the movies or to the store, but there are days when you have a misleading information walking around your town about how your stocks will do. Barry, I want to ask you about a fascinating story that you have in your book. It's a family story. It's the Belfer family. So many layers to it. And I work with families with multi-generational wealth. So the story really resonated with me and reminded me of the stories of my clients in many cases. Rags to riches tale, multi-generational family fortune that build on top of each other. And then a series of misfortunes. Not just any misfortunes, but the ones that we will all remember. How did they get rich? What happened next? What can we learn from it?
So, a little background to that story. A buddy of mine, it works in one of the big conference organizations, and he's always inviting me down to Florida to speak, and I certainly don't want to go to Florida June, July, August. And he said, hey, we're doing a event up in Brooklyn. Do you want to present? Okay. Like, I've run out of excuses, and I had to come up with a new presentation. Around the same time, there's a story of the Belfers shows up in the Financial Times. And I'm reading the story with just disbelief. And I start doing some research, and I start doing some homework into them and the history of their, I call it the billionaire trifecta from hell. Mm-hmm. And I have a hard time explaining this to people until I give them the full history. So I'll give you like the 2-minute version of what turned out to be a 45-minute presentation and the longest chapter in the book. I want to say it's like 12 pages, something like that. So the senior Belfer comes over to the U.S. by boat from Poland, and on the boat over, the Nazis invade Warsaw, and suddenly the zlotny in his pockets are worthless. Senior Mr. Belfer was a feather salesman, a down and feather salesman, and he immediately has to get to work in New York to bring his family, they're Jewish, to bring his family out of Poland and to just get a couple of dollars together. And he finds somebody who will finance him. He starts importing feathers and sets up the Belfer Corporation, where he's making down comforters and pillowcases and mattresses and all that stuff. By the time the 1950s, he gets his family out. They come here safely. By the 1950s, he wins the contract with the Army to make sleeping bags for the Army during the Korean War. And now there's this newfangled foam rubber stuff, and in order to use that, you need petroleum. So they set up Belfer Petroleum Company, and they just keep growing. And what was a refugee story becomes a wild American success story. His son comes into the business with him, and so by the time we get to 1980s, he has very quietly become a billionaire. They're very generous family. They donate money to all these colleges and hospitals, the Albert Einstein, Belfer Wing, and Cornell Medical School, and Harvard Kennedy School. Like, they're constantly endowing chairs and spreading the wealth around. If you come to New York City and go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is one of the biggest museums in the country, if not the world, and it runs like 10 blocks, 12 blocks up Fifth Avenue. The north wing is the Belfer sculpture garden. It's like you walk in, there's an Egyptian pyramid in there and all these sculptures. So they've been very generous over the years. The Belfer Petroleum Company gets bought for an ungodly amount of money, but the Belfers are such good operators. They make them, put them on the board of the... Arthur is the father. He's running this company. They get bought like 2 or 3 times, and the wealth just accumulates. Eventually, in the 1980s, they're purchased, and by this time, the son, Robert, is running it. They're purchased by Houston Oil and Gas, and that works really well for about 15 years. Now, if Houston Oil and Gas sounds familiar to people, well, that's because they eventually changed their name to Enron. And when they run into their trouble in the 2000s, the son, who's on the board of directors, hey, it's really bad luck for me as a director to dump my stock at the first sign of trouble. So unfortunately, he rides it down to zero, $2 billion gone. Hey, maybe we've been doing this ourselves for so long. Maybe we need help. Not a big surprise that a philanthropic Jewish family in New York is eventually introduced to Bernie Madoff. So they roll out of Enron into Bernie Madoff. By the way, this has a happy ending. I promise you the Belfers
And
are
it's not over yet.
Right. So they're with Bernie Madoff, even though if you look in the early 2000s, there were plenty of warnings. There was a big article in Barron's. A number of people have said the math doesn't work. He's running X billions of dollars. He does this split strike option thing. So not only is his returns like a smooth line up, which is impossible, no drawdowns, never a negative month. It turns out that there aren't enough options in the world to execute the split strike strategy for all his assets. And of course, ultimately, Bernie blows up. But by the way, by dumbest of coincidence, the special master in the Bernie Madoff bankruptcy was the special master in the Enron bankruptcy. They got to see the same attorney. Hey, maybe we didn't have any success doing it ourselves. We trusted an outside party. That didn't work. Maybe this stock thing isn't for us. Let's roll into this new technology called crypto, and they roll into FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. And I said they're okay. 96% of the monies invested with Madoff were returned, so it's not a giant hit there. And there's a whole nother side conversation that what Bernie Madoff really stole was time, not money. Had you invested $1 million, I want to say if you invested $1 million with Madoff in 1990, by the time he blew up, okay, sure, you got $960,000 back, but had that just been invested, it should have been worth $10 million. And FTX, because FTX was more disorganized than corrupt, and I'm not going to push back too hard and tell you they weren't doing a lot of stuff really wrong, and in the U.S. illegally, although arguably where were they, Bahamas or Bermuda? We don't know if that was truly illegal there, but it doesn't matter. They were commingling funds, they were front-running clients, they were doing all sorts of dumb stuff. But they had made some good AI investments, and they just had a bunch of kids didn't know what the hell they were doing. They had crypto accounts everywhere. By the time the special master unwound that, you ended up getting 118 cents on the dollar. So some of their investments worked out. The Bitcoin recovered post-FTX. So everybody was made whole. But the takeaway from the Belfers are, do you really have the skill set to do this yourself? Are you sure? Because to lose $2 billion because, hey, it's a bad look for a board member to be selling, that's single stock risk and it's bad judgment. To roll into somebody where there were obvious warning signs, and this isn't hindsight bias, people in real time talked about Madoff as doesn't make sense, it has to be a fraud. When you ask somebody to explain their investment strategy and it's just a bunch of razzle-dazzle bullshit and they can't really explain it to you, run, don't walk away. And then lastly, do you really need to be the first guy into crypto? I mean, or even an early adopter. You're a billionaire. You've already won. Your goal isn't to, how do I take $1 billion and turn it into $10 billion? It's how do I take $1 billion and not let it become zero? And so they made a number of mistakes. They tried to do things themselves when they weren't capable of it. Some people can. Hey, listen, our whole business model is you could do this yourself. And if you don't want to, 0.01% of you send us your money. We're happy to manage it for you. So a little discipline, a little experience, a little knowledge, you can run your own money. They clearly lack that. Who you give your money to, you better know who they are, and they better be worthy of your trust. And then the third lesson is, why are you trying to hit a home run with a novel technology when you really have to be concerned not about becoming wealthy, but staying wealthy? 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, there's a lot of truth in it.
I like that quote from your book. You say, once you become wealthy, you can afford to take less risk. I would add to it that there are certain risks that even the richest people cannot afford to take.
Losing $2 billion certainly seems like one of them. Having a major holding go to zero. Look, the whole purpose of financial planning and having a goal for your money, whether it's retirement or philanthropy or generational wealth payment transfer, or just simply paying for your kids' college, is when you know what the goal is and you have a timeline associated with that, you can marry a portfolio to an appropriate level of risk. But there's a couple of chapters in the book, all the people who bought deeply subsidized General Electric stock from the company in their 401k, and only to see that get cut in half. Why are you taking so much single stock risk? There's the Arab sheik who put half of his net wealth into gold. By the way, that trade worked out. Still a bad trade, right? You look at the process, not the result. You could have a great process, and every now and then the results don't pay off. I forgot, Annie Duke talked about resulting, that there was I don't remember if it was a Super Bowl or a playoff game, where it's 4th and inches, and of course the math says you go for it on 4th and inches, and they did, and they were stopped at the line in football, and everybody slagged the coach. And the answer is, if it's a good process and the odds are in your favor, the outcome is not relevant, because it's not gonna be 100%. If you only score 3 out of 4 times in those circumstances, hey, do the math. If you kick a field goal, it's pretty much a sure thing that you're gonna get 3 points. That's 12 points overall. If you only score a touchdown 3 out of 4 times, that's 21 points. You don't score on the 4th one. 21, last I checked, is more than 12. The math behind that makes sense. You have to accept that sometimes even the best hitters strike out. The greatest, to mix sports metaphors, the greatest hitter of all time, Ted Williams, broke 400 once briefly, and that means that more than half the times he's not getting a hit. So you have to recognize the odds. You have to recognize that failure is part of the process. We make mistakes. The problem comes when we fail to learn from those mistakes.
It's a powerful lesson. Barry, I have one big question before I ask you about your definition of success, which I like to ask about. You talk about the everyday investors playing a fundamentally different game than Wall Street professionals, and you can use it to their advantage. I'll add to it. You also talk about March 2020, which is still a fresh memory to many of us. And you reveal how Wall Street professionals panicked and sold, while retail investors stayed calm and bought. Talk to me about those everyday investors.
Sure. So if you're a mom and pop Main Street investor, your bonus isn't dependent on how well you do in the market. Your job isn't dependent on that. Just your salary, just all the things that I'm putting money away for when I retire in 20, 25, 30 years. Who cares what happens in any given month or quarter or even year? But if you're a finance professional managing assets for other people, what do you have to do? You have to have a nice expensive office somewhere and a research staff, and you take phone calls from clients all the time. I have a buddy who used to run a hedge fund, and he eventually rolled that into a family office. And I asked him, that's a lot of money you're giving up. Why? He's like, I'm tired of explaining and defending weekly performance of the fund. Weekly? Isn't that random? Yes, but tell that to someone who's got $100 million with me and is not happy that last week we were down 6%. All right, I kind of get that. It's a very different set of obligations and requirements when you're managing money on behalf of other people. When you're running your own money, you could look stupid for a long period of time and not worry about getting fired. If you dollar cost averaged from, 1966 to 1982 is my favorite example, but more recently, if you started putting money in the market in 2000, most of the bets you made over that period didn't pay off until 2013. right? It ran up to 2007, 08. We fell at 56% drop, pretty close back to 2000, 1999, 2000 levels. You had rallies and sell-offs. But once you got it past the financial crisis, and technically I would mark the start of the new bull market in 2013, but that's just technical. Like once you got past 2009, we were off to the races. And all those buys you made in the 2000s when you were dollar costing averaging, if you were a professional investor, you would be fired. As an amateur investor, all those bets really paid off over the past 15 years. That's a huge advantage, not having to answer to someone else for short-term fluctuations and volatility when you're buying a broad index for the long haul.
I think it's a great lesson there that a professional investor has a whole different set of expectations to consider. And somebody managing their own money has so much more freedom when you really think about it, and they can really wait and they can't be fired from the job they have. Barry, one last question. How do you think about success?
To me, success is a combination of freedom and life satisfaction and collaborative building. This goes back to the original question, what is money? Money is something that allows you to do what you want to do when you want to do it. If you want to keep working, well, keep working in the job of your choice. If you don't want to work, well, success lets you say, I'm going to retire, or I'm going to shift to something that's perhaps less financially rewarding, but more fulfilling. And so success is, to me, is the ability to, whatever you touch, you're making better. The people around you raise their game. I'm not a crazy sports fan, but sports metaphors really work. When you watch someone like a LeBron James play and make everybody around them better. So to me, that's a definition of success. I see Howard Marks as that sort of example where the whole team he has really stepped up, and there's hundreds and hundreds of other people who do that. The freedom to do what you want when you want it, and the freedom to not do what you don't want. When I was a kid, I saved money mowing lawns and shoveling snow. I don't want to mow lawns or shovel snow, and so I'm very happy to pay someone to do that. Success to me means being able to spend my time and energy doing satisfaction things with people I love. That is success.
I love what I'm hearing. I'm very grateful for this conversation. I learned a lot. I highly recommend the book, How Not to Invest. It's a book that will make you think. There's so many books out there, but this book really made me think and see things differently. Although I've been investing professionally for over 20 years, it opened my eyes and reminded me of some really important principles. And at the end of the day, time works in our favor. Don't do anything stupid, and do it for a long period of time. That's what I walked away with, and lots of funny anecdotes in between. So I highly recommend the book. Barry, thank you so much for today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Tom Morgan for introducing us. He's one of my favorite people.
Tom is really special, a kind soul out there. Thank you, Tom.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show, one click